ready to serve. Though age and experience are normally priorities in God's requirements for spiritual leadership, we are all to be available for God's use to achieve His divine purposes in this world. Here now is Gene Getz.
This is one of the very first principles that emerges right from the very beginning in the book of Jeremiah. And that is that God is going to speak to Jeremiah even though he's a very young man. And He's going to challenge him. He's going to call him. And so we're going to begin with actually verse 4 of chapter 1, which I've called the call of Jeremiah. In verses 4 and 5, the word of the Lord came to me. And I want you to notice that this was a very personal experience on the part of Jeremiah, and this was communication from God Himself. That's an awesome thought in itself. Because of all humanity, very few people literally had this kind of experience with God to give us what we have in the Scriptures today. And here's what God said. I chose you before I formed you in the womb. And you'll notice the backdrop to this particular message is a picture of the womb. And isn't it interesting that in this passage, God is addressing Jeremiah as one who is alive in the womb. I addressed you. And you see the word you all the way through. Before the womb, in the womb, after the womb. And so God said, I set you apart before you were born. Before you were born. You, while you were in the womb. Need I say more about that? That really communicates. I appointed you a prophet to the nations. Now, this was a startling message for Jeremiah. And we see that in his fear, Jeremiah's fear. In verse 6, but I protested. Oh no, Lord God, look, I don't know how to speak since I'm only a youth. Now, if you think about it, and if you look at the context, you can understand why he was afraid. He was fearful. We don't know exactly how old he was, except that he says, I'm a youth. That word, by the way, in Hebrew was used anywhere from birth up to 20 or early 20s. Some believe he probably was in his late teens, or at least in his early 20s. And God is going to choose him to do something that is remarkable. In fact, it's intimidating. It's frightening. Now you see, Jeremiah lived just about 3 miles northeast of Jerusalem. That's very close. He was of the priestly class. And when you're living that close, and maybe even his father was a priest, he knows what's going on inside the walls of Jerusalem. He knows the evil that's going on inside the walls of Jerusalem. And so he protests. He's fearful. But the Lord reassures him. Then the Lord said to me, do not say, I'm only a youth. God's not putting him down. But what God is saying, I'm going to speak through you. For you will go to everyone I send you to and speak whatever I tell you. Do not be afraid of anyone, for I will be with you to deliver you. And then at this particular point, God says something to him that he repeats again and again throughout this book. This is the Lord's declaration. I am God. I'm speaking to you. And I'm asking you to do something where I will be with you, regardless of how young you are. Now, centuries later, I couldn't help but think of Timothy. Paul left him in Ephesus. It was a tough task. He was to set in order what was happening there. There were religious leaders that were trying to emerge to become leaders in the church who were not qualified, theologically or in their lifestyle. And so Paul challenged Timothy with these words, and it's an echo, really, from the Old Testament in terms of what God said to Jeremiah. Here's what Paul said: "Let no one despise your youth." Now, Timothy was probably a little older than Jeremiah, maybe 27, 28, 29, 30, we're not sure. That's young, by the way, to have the responsibility that he had there in Ephesus with all the carnality that was taking place. "Let no one despise your youth. Instead, you should be an example to the believers in speech, in conduct, in love, in faith, in purity." And then he says something that relates to communication through preaching and teaching. First, he said, be an example, because your example in these areas is what gives you credibility in terms of your speech, what you say. And so he says, "Until I come, give your attention to public reading, exhortation, and teaching." A real challenge, because Timothy obviously was intimidated, and Paul was saying, don't allow yourself to be intimidated, but be an example in all of these areas. And I will be with you. God will be with you, Timothy, Paul was saying to young Timothy. So here's the reflection and response question, I think, that comes with this principle. What other biblical examples can you think of where God used younger people to achieve his purposes in this world? And I raise that question because it gives us more substantial biblical evidence that God does use young people. It's an exception, generally speaking, but God did. For example, Joseph, 17 years old when he was sold by his brothers into Egypt. He went through horrible things there, but through it all, he became the prime minister of Egypt when he was about 30 years old, probably the age of Timothy when he was in Ephesus. A little older than when God called Jeremiah to do this tremendous task. Daniel was 17 when he and 3 other young men were taken into captivity on the first siege on the part of Nebuchadnezzar. Was taken into Babylon, along with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 4 young men, and particularly Daniel, was used immediately in that situation. When I say immediately, within the first year or two, to have a tremendous impact. And Daniel, of course, lived into his 80s there in that area, serving not only the Babylonian king, but the kings of Medo and Persia. God used him. And then the interesting thing is that, as we'll see, and as we see in the opening verses, Jeremiah was called during the time of Josiah, and Josiah became king when he was 8 years old in Judah. But when he was about 26 years old, he found the book of the law and began to bring reforms into Judah. So God uses young people. And so here's the principle that comes right into our culture today. Though age and experience are normally priorities in God's requirement for spiritual leadership, and that's true. In fact, when you look at the New Testament, it talks about elders, which implies older men who have experience, who are more mature, though not exclusively referring to older people. But the norm is that with age should come experience, wisdom, as believers, to lead. But there are exceptions. And that's what we're saying with this principle. Though age and experience are normally priorities in God's requirements for spiritual leadership, we are all to be available for God's use to achieve his divine purposes in this world. And I might add, no matter what our age.